Thanks, everybody. It's really good to welcome you here to Lazard's. We're a sellout. Isn't that fantastic? So congratulations on getting a seat, of course. May I introduce myself, because I don't have anybody to introduce me. So my name is Philippa Whipple, and I'm the president of the Merton Society. And in that role, can I just give you a few headlines? I don't want to take up too much time because we have more important things coming. But 2 dates, please, for your diary, if you're so minded. The first date is a London dinner that the Merton Society is hosting on the 15th of May, so coming up quite soon. We haven't had one for a few years. In fact, I think we haven't had one since the COVID years. So this is quite a big venture for us, and it would be wonderful to, again, have a full house. It's at the Vintners Hall, which is the most beautiful old hall, and I believe there are still some spaces spare. The speaker for the evening is Andy Cato, who may be known to some of you because he was in Groove Armada. Others may know him because he was on the Jeremy Clarkson farming show thing, but he's into sustainable farming. I think he'll be really interesting. Please come if you can. And there's a discount, by the way, if you are actually looking at this audience. I hardly need to say this. If you're a very young alumnus. Okay. The next one, please, for your diaries, is our garden party, which we have every other year. This year it's on Saturday, the 28th of June. And it's usually just really lovely. It's a very gentle afternoon. The sun always shines. Merton always looks amazing. The flowers are out. It's fantastic. But it's just a nice, easy afternoon at Merton. So please think about that. Saturday, the 28th of June. Third, I have a request for you. And those of you who have met me before know that it's a perennial request, and it's about mentoring, which is a pet project of mine. We now have the Merton Mentoring it's called, MCM, Merton College Mentoring, up and running, and every Merton graduate is entitled to ask or can ask us for a mentor. We need more mentors. So please do think about putting yourself forward. You'll get support from the college. You'll, I hope, find it really engaging and rewarding to be able to build up a relationship with typically a younger Mertonian who's trying to find their feet in, let's face it, a rather disrupted world. So if you can give of your time, we'd be really grateful. By all means, come and talk to me or Chelsea or any of the other Merton people here if you'd like to know a little bit more about it, but we'd be very grateful. And then can I just do a wrap-up? The Merton Society. Let me talk about the Merton Society, which is the organisation over which I preside. The Merton Society, well, really, it's you, it's us. We are it. I'd really like to thank the college and the council, which is my committee, for all the support that they give the Merton Society and the many activities that we do. This evening's event is one of them. And the ethos of the Merton Society is simply to promote the idea that once a Mertonian, always a Mertonian, and you are always welcome as part of the Merton family for as long as you want to be part of our family. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you for being part of the event this evening. My next job is to introduce Professor Steven Gunn. I think from looking at the audience, he's known to quite a lot of you this evening because he's obviously sent an email around to all his former alumni saying, come along. But no. He is a Mertonian, I'm pleased to say, tutor in history since 1989. He teaches and researches the history of later medieval and early modern Britain and Europe. He's written lots of books, and you may have some on your bookshelf. He's a radio and TV commentator. He's fantastically engaging to listen to. His current research project is on accidental death and everyday life, and that's going to produce a book which you will all be buying when it comes out in June, but also a top trumps card game at the slender price, I know, because I looked today, of £8 plus £4.50 for postage and packing if you want to buy it on the internet from the Oxford University shop. But look, it's a grand enterprise. Steve, we're so pleased to have you here and for everybody to have come and listened to you. So now, over to you.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's lovely to keep looking around the audience and spotting more and more of my pupils. And greetings, as we've all got used to saying in the last 5 years, to the online community. And I bring you greetings from the college. I think we're all in good heart. We're gearing up for the summer term, and historians will want to know that this year's finalists are just back from the history reading party, now in Herefordshire rather than Cornwall, where, as ever, we managed to relax and read and talk about some history books at the same time and eat large quantities of cake, which, as you all know, is a tradition. Now, we historians always tell scientists that one of the good things about us is that we are cheap. We don't need lots of people, we don't need big machinery, we just sit in a library and read stuff, we don't bother anybody. By and large, of course, that's true, but there are occasions when we do longer lasting and slightly larger things. And so I thought, as well as telling you what's in this book that I've been writing, you might be interested to hear a bit more about the whole process of running a bigger project in history and the various different highways and byways that it's taken me down. So this project on accidental death began as a kind of twinkle in my eye some years ago, largely through the work of other historians. A medievalist called Barbara Hannawalt, who wrote a book about medieval families using coroner's inquests, showing what kind of accidents small boys and small girls had. A book by MacDonald and Murphy about suicide using coroner's inquests. And the first things I started looking at were archery accidents, because 16th century social commentators complained that Englishmen were all going down the pub and playing football and not doing their archery practice. The nation's moral fibre was in complete collapse. We would never win another war, etc. I thought, well, actually, you could test that by were people having accidents doing archery practice, and it turned out they were, but decliningly so. So that sort of fitted. So that's what I started with. I then did a pilot project on 1%, so that's 1 year's worth of all the coroner's inquests in the National Archives. We'll look at coroner's inquests in a minute from the 16th century. And I applied for funding. This is the kind of research grant that one then had to fill in. These days, the research grant, I think it must be my age, but I'm trying to fill in one at the moment where instead of sending in a CV that says what you've done, you have to fill in a form called R4, the Arabic numeral, RI, which stands for Ready for Research and Innovation. And that 4 with an Arabic numeral, I just can't get over that. But anyway, so you fill in the funding form in the attempt to get funding, and we were successful, which then meant that I could employ Thomas down here, the postdoc, to go to the National Archives at Kew, which looks beautiful, as you can see, with a camera, find all the 16th century coroner's inquests, of which there are about 9,000, take photographs of them so that we then had the photographs to work on. And what he then did, here's a coroner's inquest. So that's what they look like. That's one of the more legible ones. And it records a very common kind of accident. A young woman going to fetch water, in this case from the River Thames at Kingston upon Thames, and she falls into the river. And the kind of information that you have in these that you can do things with is of various sorts. So first of all, it tells you where it happened, Kingston super Thames, it says, up in the top box there. Tells you who the coroner was, and it tells you who the jurors were, which is useful because it means you can think about whether the jurors are the kind of people who would actually have understood what had happened or not really. Whether they're local, it turns out, not that surprisingly, they're middle-aged men of roughly middling social status, most of them from the village where it happened, but some from the villages around, probably to stop the locals just fixing it if they wanted to fix it. That appears to be roughly what happened. You compare them with the names of the jurors with tax listings to test that kind of thing. So it tells you who the jurors are. It tells you who the victim was. So this is Isadora Della, age of 30 years, one of the daughters of John Della of Tolworth. So we've got quite a lot of detail on her relationships with people, how old she is, and so on, where she came from. Tolworth's in the parish of Longdisson. He's a husbandman, so he's farming a sort of family-sized farm. So that tells you that, and then it tells you what happened, and this is where she goes to the River Thames near Kingston to try to get the water. So that's the basic detail we're extracting from all these reports. And what we did with it, and sometimes the report's written in Latin, because that's the language of legal record, but sometimes the jurors say things that either the clerk thinks, well, that's such specific detail, I better just write down what they said, or he thinks, who on earth knows the Latin word for that? So sometimes you have things saying, picking flowers in Latin called primroses, because he thinks, well, what on earth's the Latin for a primrose? Nobody knows that, so called primroses. But in this case, he says she had 2 pails to carry water with, which is a reassurance if you've ever been told off by an English teacher for putting a preposition at the end of a clause, because clearly people, even in Shakespeare's time, they put their prepositions at the end of clauses. 2 pails to carry water with. So we have these bits of English detail. So what we did with them was to put them all into a very big Excel spreadsheet, which those of you who are technically sophisticated will think is not very technically sophisticated, but it was a useful way to manage the material that we had, with details like what's the reference for the document, what county was it happening in, what place was it happening in. The blue things you might guess are clickable links because we put them all on a map. The date of the inquest, the name of the victim, male or female, do we know where they came from, do we know their job, etc. So we put all the details together like that, and then we could start to pull out accidents of different sorts and process them. So this is how you work out things like how long does it take you to die if you get shot in the 16th century, and pretty often instant. Which is in a way not surprising, but also is very interesting when you think, well, why did armies in the 16th century give up bows and arrows and start using guns? Because lots of people get hit by arrows in archery practice, but often the arrow goes in half an inch or something and they die from blood poisoning 2 weeks later. So if you're thinking, well, why does an army want guns? This probably is one reason. If you hit somebody with a gun, they stay hit. So we processed the material like that, and that then gave us the kind of things we put in the book, which is a mixture of large-scale, how often does this happen, who does it happen to, when does it happen, how long does it take you to die, etc., and then detail of the sort that we'll see as we start to go through some of what's in the chapters. So that's how we processed it. We also, because one has to these days, have a website in which we had a discovery of the month, which I don't want to disillusion you, but of course wasn't necessarily something we discovered that month. It was just something that happened in the same month. There's a couple of empty seats down here if anybody's in need of an empty seat. It was something that happened in the month that we were posting about. And Thomas the postdoc is very good at finding pictures of things, so it also has pictures on if you find the need to go and look at it. We did the kind of things academics do, so we published academic journal articles and book chapters like this Sport and Recreation in 16th Century England, the Evidence of Accidental Deaths, and we published things in popular history magazines like BBC History Magazine. This is something about how you can get killed going to church in the 16th century. So we started to spread things around like that. And of course, we also did quite a lot of lectures. I think we've done about 80 public talks now of various sorts. This one was particularly interesting because it was in the Ashmolean Museum, which was great, and we were using pictures of objects from the Ashmolean Museum, like knives from the excavations when they built Seacourt Tower, you know, the sort of shopping place and garages on the way out of Oxford. What we didn't realise was it was part of we knew it was part of an Ashmolean event called Dead Friday, which was all to do with different things to do with death in the museum. Now, I suppose I'm old. I sometimes do find the way that students dress a bit unconventional and think, well, that's surprising. That's obviously what young people are doing these days. There did seem to be a lot of students who looked rather like zombies in the audience, but it turned out they'd got the University Drama Society to turn up as zombies in order to give the general death theme a bit of a boost. But anyway, so we gave quite a lot of lectures, and the University Press Office, of course, are keen to get this stuff out as widely as possible. And so we found ourselves on the BBC website with 10 strange ways Tudors died. I didn't do what I normally do when people do that and say you can't use Tudors to mean people who lived in the Tudor period. But anyway, and it was much liked by people on the BBC website. The thing they thought we should launch the whole project with was this girl called Jane Shakespeare who drowns picking flowers. So rather shamelessly we went for, was this Shakespeare's cousin? We don't know. Was this the real Ophelia? We don't know. But it got all the way to the Iran Book News Agency website and various South American newspapers, so and Radio New Zealand, actually. So it got quite a long way. And sometimes the newspapers slightly catch themselves out here. So the Daily Mail got quite excited with the not-so-beautiful game. More people died playing football than sword fighting in capitals in Tudor times, historian discovers. What they used to illustrate it was, in fact, an April Fool picture produced by another website some years earlier, because they've taken a picture from the site of the sinking of the Mary Rose and inserted an England against France football match. And if you look right down at the bottom, I put the red square around it, it says, on ye first day of April 1545. But clearly whoever was working for the Daily Mail didn't spot that one. But anyway, it all gives a bit of public oomph behind the project and the research. We did some TV as well, so Hidden Killers of the Tudor Home was less down market than it sounds. But although one of my more striking sort of television experiences was I was filming this interview with Susanna Lipscomb, who does a lot of Tudor early modern historical television. This was earlier in her career, and the producer said to the cameraman, "We could put Susie in Tudor clothes and put her in a pond." And she looked quite alarmed when they were saying this, but she's very professional, carried on interviewing me, and they did put her in Tudor clothes in a pond and mic'd her up. And of course she did say, if I was an archaeologist, I'd say, look, this is experimental archaeology. They put her in Tudor clothes in a pond, and she did get waterlogged and cold very fast and found it quite hard to get out of the pond, which is probably why lots of Tudor people who fall into ponds fetching water can't get themselves out again. So we did a bit of television. Now, at this stage, projects like this start to take on a life of their own. And I must explain that the next screenshot was not made by me. It was made by some of my students. You may be in the room with the subtitles on. Because on QI, they used our stuff about football accidents. So that was sort of leakage. We hadn't planted that at all. Somebody just picked it up. Likewise, Horrible Histories picked up our archery accidents and actually did it rather well. They turned a sort of nice one-liner, because there is this man, I suspect actually he's holding his hat when he says to his friend, "I bet you can't hit my hat," which is what the report describes. But they made it more vivid by having the man with his hat on his head saying, and I said to him, "I bet you can't hit my hat." Do you know he couldn't? There he is with the arrow through his head. So we had a bit of horrible histories. The university, in particular Torch, which is the research centre in the humanities, which is partly charged with trying to get humanities academics to take our research out into the wider community. They were involved with the thing at the Ashmolean. They had various public events for which we developed a sort of interactive public outreach. First of all, a game with boards, and then a card game. Now, if you're my age or older, possibly a bit younger, you might remember a round on a question of sport, where they would show film of a sporting event and then stop it and say what happened next. And usually what happened next was a vulture came down and picked up the golf ball, or something equally bizarre that you couldn't predict. So we did a Tudor Accidents What Happened Next, where we had several options and then said, well, you know, did the dog run into church and bite the person? Did the church collapse on them, or did something else happen? And got people to guess. That then developed into the more sophisticated Top Trumps card game, which I shan't advertise because it's already been advertised. But one of the engaging things about this from our point of view, which is a kind of in-joke, is that Thomas, the postdoc, did the pictures, and the pictures are, many of them, based on people that he knows. So the miller who looks peculiarly disgruntled is his grumpy uncle in Poland, and the man riding the wet sheep, who of course falls off the wet sheep and drowns, is Thomas himself, and I'm Gun Blunder, not surprisingly, because he's developed a nice English taste for puns. So we produced that game too as a sort of outreach tool. The other rather strange thing I found myself doing for Torch was they decided to have a comedy research event called Whose Lie Is It Anyway, in which we had 2 academics and 2 actors presenting bits of research, and the audience had to guess who was the academic presenting the real research and who was the actor pretending to present research. So one of the actors was doing Smurfs are real and their language is very interesting, which is kind of interesting, but I'm not sure it persuaded people. The one that persuaded people was somebody showing their pictures of cats with very slightly different expressions, explaining that they'd worked out exactly what the expressions of these cats meant. Anyway, so I did Tudor health and safety advice based on our research, which is entirely based on our research, so don't go to Rutland, is serious advice, because look at the recorded fatal accidents per 10,000 estimated inhabitants for selected English counties. Rutland absolutely lethal. And the main reason seems to be that a lot of big towns don't send their records in. So Hampshire looks really safe because there's no records from Southampton, no records from Portsmouth, no records from Andover, whereas Rutland, there aren't any big towns, and the small towns like Oakham loyally send in their records. So Rutland comes out looking peculiarly dangerous. So then we also obviously have serious things to do in this. So we were a Research Excellence Framework 2014 impact case study. Now, this is the exercise every 5 years or so where universities have to send in to the assessors saying, this is the best research we think we've done over the last 5 years, and it includes about for every 1 in 10 academics that you have to do a study of the public impact of your research. So it involves filling in forms like this. What lies behind this is giving talks to people like the Lincolnshire branch of the Workers' Educational Association and saying, would you kindly fill in this questionnaire, in which we would quite like you to tick the thing that says, I now know more about everyday life and accidental death in Tudor England than I did before I came to this lecture. So it's not an extraordinarily sophisticated operation, but I think the Iran Book News Agency probably made it onto there as well, because that's impact, isn't it? So we did that. We also found that our data, people started to realise, was useful for other research projects. So we shared our data with a big project in Exeter on women's work and forms of labour. And so our data on the southwest, which was the area they were looking at, they were mostly using material from court depositions, particularly church court depositions, because a lot of business in church courts in the 16th and early 17th century is about, for example, rights to claim tithes on crops. So people will say, well, the vicar came along and he took more grain than he should have done, and I know because I was doing the harvest, and Jane Smith was there, and John Brown was there, and Peter Jones was there, and Alice Wheelwright was there as well. So you get a sense of who are the people doing work. But our stuff, because we'd got individuals having accidents doing particular jobs, they were able to feed that into it as well. So we were data sharing with them. Then the time came to write, oh no, actually, just before that, the other thing about all this kind of public outreach stuff is that obviously you push various doors that open and you push various doors that don't open. So amongst the doors that didn't open, for some reason we're jammed. We did a radio pitching competition, and the, I think, over-enthusiastic radio pitching company said, I know what, let's put to Radio 4, we could replace Tweet of the Day with Tudor Accent of the Day. And I did think, that is really quite optimistic. And you know what? It failed. So that failed. We found various accidents that happened in places that are now open as heritage sites, like Colchester Castle, where there's an attempted mass breakout from the prison in the dungeon on Christmas Day 1502. And they said, oh, thank you, that's interesting, but they didn't say, that's great, we're going to put that in our new exhibition and therefore you can get lots of credit for it and so on. So that was a bit of a try. The one of these that was successful in the end, after many years of trying, was to get funding for an interactive map of accidents. And we've managed to get funding from a sort of internal Oxford digital humanities thing for that. And so we're busy making that at the moment. And I can't remember what the upside down man was for, but he probably is just a symbol of failure. Sooner or later, I had to write the book. So I drafted it at 140,000 words, and I knew that was too long because the publishers had said they wanted 90,000. But academic publishers, you know, you say, well, you said 90,000, it's 105, you know, that'll be all right, won't it? So I said to them, well, I've got it down from 140 to 105. I'm not sure which are the bits to cut. And they said, all the bits that are more than 90,000. So I thought, all right then. So I cut more and more and more until I got to 89,121. So that was the cutting. People always talk about killing your darlings. Basically, whenever I had two favourite examples of something, one of them had to go. It does mean we have lots of other examples left spare, if anybody has any useful, like offcuts of carpet or something. We've got lots of Tudor accidents left. There was also, in dialogue with the publishers, quite a lot of reorganisation. So we started off with 19 chapters in an order that made perfect sense to me. We ended up with 17 chapters in a different order that made perfect sense to them. And that's what we've settled down on. And as readers, if you read it, you'll have to see what you think as to whether it worked. So what was the book then that's come out of all this? I took out a slide. I took out quite a lot of slides because I had too many slides. I did have a slide with a picture of Lord Byron because we're publishing with John Murray, which was Lord Byron's publisher, which occasionally makes me feel quite Byronic, but probably better not. Right, so we came out with these chapters, and here's the book with a slightly cheesy but not grievously distasteful cover, I think. The original version did have 17th century people on the front, so I'm afraid I did put my foot down at that and said, I'm sorry, I would like 16th century people. I found them a free picture of a 16th century person. What else can you do for your publisher, more than find them a free picture of a 16th century person? Anyway, that's what they did. So we start off with Another Tudor England is the opening chapter, which just introduces the book, but also looks at things like where have we got reports from. As you can see, almost every county in England, including Monmouthshire, which for some purposes was counted as part of England, not County Durham, Lancashire or Cheshire, because they're Palatine counties, they kept their records separately. A few of the Cheshire ones survive amongst Cheshire archives in the National Archives, but the main run that we were looking at is all these counties. And what this map does is compare the number of accidents with the number of men in the militia in Elizabeth's reign, which, because all men between 16 and 60 were meant to serve in the militia, is a rough proxy for the number of population. And so what that shows us, reassuringly, is that there weren't more accidents in Yorkshire just because people in Yorkshire were very accident prone. There actually were more people in Yorkshire, and likewise there were quite a lot of people in those East Anglian counties in Kent where there are lots of accidents, and fewer people in those more thinly populated Midlands counties, Worcestershire and places like that. And interestingly, shows up the one big anomaly, which is the southwest, where it looks as though they just, until the 1580s and 90s, they just weren't very good at sending in reports, because there's quite a thin number of reports. You can see light green on the accidents map on the left, but quite heavily populated. Big seafaring communities, big mining communities, as well as farming in Devon and Cornwall in the 16th century on the right. So it introduces that sort of thing, and then it says, what you know about Tudor history is mostly about famous people, Elizabeth I, Henry VIII, and all that. And actually, they do enter this world of accidents, but always on the margins. So here's an Elizabeth I on the margin accidents. Elizabeth I likes splendid celebrations and displays. At her court, they included a firework display on the Thames on May Day, 1st of May, 1559. During that firework display, a barrel of gunpowder caught fire. The sailors all rushed to one end of the boat tipped over, and one sailor drowned. And there is actually a London chronicler who writes about this happening and says the Queen and her ladies were looking out of the window when this thing happened, and somebody drowned during the accident. So that's the first chapter. The second chapter is called All Sorts of People. It's about the all sorts of people that we've got in the book, and it enables us to compare the accident figures with other sets of figures that classify the population in various different ways, particularly wonderful figures for Gloucestershire in the early 17th century, where they take the whole militia, so the whole adult male population, and they tell you what job almost all of them do. So that means we can work out what's a safe job and what's a dangerous job. So roughly similar rates of accidental death and numbers of people doing the job for something like building. So building's quite dangerous, but not very dangerous. Metal trades start to look a bit more safe. Water transport starts to look a bit more dangerous. But the thing that looks really dangerous is working in a mill, a water mill or a windmill. And we'll see why later, but basically this is the fastest moving and heaviest machinery that most people are working with. Because a cart is dangerous, but a mill is more dangerous, and it's also very hard to control in various ways. What's safe? Textile work, weaving, things like that. Lots and lots of weavers in 16th century England. There are lots of weavers in the accidents, but they're all getting kicked by horses and falling off bridges and things like that. It seems to be impossible to kill yourself weaving, as far as we can tell. There's one person who's hit by a spinning wheel, and I suspect she's a very small child. So it looks like it's a safe job. Milling, interestingly, people in the 16th century think that millers are shocking profiteers because they will always not quite give you back all the grain that you've given them, or they'll overcharge you, or whatever. So maybe it's a risky job, but you can make good money at it. Maybe. People talk about millers having golden thumbs because they measure things with their golden thumb, which is always stocking up their gold pile. So that's that chapter. So the next chapter is called At the Coroner's Court. This is about how the inquest process works, and also, does that mean we can depend on what these inquests are telling us? And so that looks at particularly the reports where you get a bit more detail. So here's a classic windmill accident. It talks about the jurors. They go and look at the body. The jurors have got the body in front of them because they have to describe the wounds on the body. He's the keeper of one windmill. He's found in the upper chamber of the will. What do they see when they look at the body? 2 of his ribs was broken, and also his right arm. And by this, it did well and sufficiently appear to the said jury. You can see the clerk's just given up on Latin. He's just writing it down in English now. Did well and sufficiently appear to the said jury. He was killed in the following way, while he was greasing the collar of the axle tree. And this is one of the reasons why mills are so dangerous. The machinery is made of wood. You need to grease it with tallow to keep it turning smoothly. And obviously, if you go out and shut the water gate and wait for the water wheel to stop turning and wait for everything to slow down and then grease it, or you go and tie up the sails of the windmill even though the wind's blowing and you're getting really good grinding time, you just lose lots and lots of time. So you think, I bet I can just get some tallow on that while it's going round, and then people's sleeves get caught, their clothes get caught, their hair gets caught, somebody gets caught by the dagger hanging at his belt, they get dragged in, and in this case, sudden gust of wind caused the sails to move, cogwheel turned, caught his clothes, sore wounded him, breaking his right arm and 2 of his ribs. And some of these accounts, they actually say, well, you can tell he put his hand in, and then his hand got pulled in, and then his arm got pulled in, and then his shoulder got pulled in, and then his head got pulled in. So mills are alarming, and that fits with what we've just seen about the dangers of mills. So that's how the jurors decide, and you can also sometimes see how do the jurors think about accidents. So we've got 2 things where they talk about astrology. 16th century medical books had a sort of an astrological map, a zodiac man, as they call it, of the body, like this, which shows there are different signs of the zodiac relevant to your health of different parts of your body at different times of year. And here we have a tanner who's trying to break up a fight between dogs. His foot gets cut by the tooth of one dog, and the jurors are clearly thinking, how on earth can you die from that? And they think, well, there must be some reason. And they say, oh, well, he died from it because the sign of the foot was then reigning in that place. And likewise, you have somebody who cuts herself in the thigh with a knife, and she died instantly because in that leg and place, the sign will rule at that time. I'm not good enough at star signs to know. I think I checked them, and they're both roughly right in terms of what seems to apply to what. Then our next chapter is called In Sickness and in Health. So this is about health, how people maintain their health, what you can tell. Because often, of course, they don't record people who just die from diseases, but they do record people who've got a disease and then have an accident. So, for example, we have one young woman who is running a very high fever. She comes downstairs. I think probably she's a household servant because she can't get out of the door. Maybe somebody else has locked the door. So she smashes a hole in the wall, which is much easier in the 16th century than it is now because walls are made of wattle and daub, goes out into the garden to get a drink of water and falls into the pond. So you find out about diseases in that way. And you also find how people try to treat themselves. So don't try this at home. Anne Whiffin had intestinal worms. That I've put, the picture is from a book on horse medicine from the 16th century. It says, well, horses have 3 kinds of worms like people do. There's the little round ones like children get. And you think, oh, okay, lots of people have got worms in the 16th century. So she had worms, fed up with it, so she ground up some rat poison, mixed it into ale and drank it, thinking that will kill the worms. And didn't suspect, and the jurors are pretty clear, she wasn't doing this because she knew it would kill her. She was doing it thinking it would get rid of the worms, and obviously it didn't. She became ill, and she died 2 days later. Then we can look at families and households. And one of the things you can see here is the way in which the family is actually a working unit. So here's a husbandman, family farmer. He's working in an outhouse in Somerset called the Ring House. So it's got a ring, it's got a cider press in it, and they're taking down a big beam from the top of the cider press. Now this cider press is in a farm museum, I think, on the Channel Islands, but it looks so much like the one that's described in the report, because what his sons are doing is turning round the bars or levers, like the bars or levers coming out of those round things there, which turn a screw on the press, and you've got these screw-shaped things going up and down, which presumably press down the press to squeeze the apple juice out for making cider with. And Thomas, one of the sons, is 7 feet off the ground, presumably going to steady the beam, but the beam comes off unexpectedly, hits him on the head, and again they give you quite grievous details of the accidents, that the injuries they can see on the body, because that explains why he died 15 minutes later. That's the logic of giving these very detailed explanations. Nobody can say to these jurors, well, you didn't explain why he died 15 minutes later, because they say, oh yes, we did. So they show you families working together. They also, and this is a very rare find, this is the kind of things we only find once in 9,000, they show you driving lessons. So this is a 9-year-old boy being taught to drive a cart by his father, and he's under the rule and guidance of his father, and you can tell, I think, that the jurors are middle-aged men, because they keep saying, and it wasn't the father's fault. He says, under the rule and guidance of his father, rashly, without consulting his father, they say, he ran and jumped into the cart as it was moving. It startled the black thill horse. So the thill horse is the horse between the shafts. We'll come across thill horses again in a minute. Turned to one side, the cart fell over sideways, he's hit on the head, and they're doing it in the gravel pits at Remelton. Well, this is a 19th century Ordnance Survey map. The gravel pit was still there in the fields round the village, and presumably it's just a nice quiet place to go. When I learnt to drive, my dad took me on an old airfield, and it's the same sort of principle. You just go somewhere where there's not going to be much going on. But sadly, Thomas Cockerell, age 9, got carried away. And if that seems young to be learning to drive a cart, we've got lots of 11 and 12-year-old boys driving cars. It's to be standard work for young boys in this period. And I was once talking about this somewhere, and somebody said, and I suddenly thought, yes, I suppose that's right. If you've got a 12-year-old boy and 2 grown men, who do you have driving the cart and who do you have loading it? You have the grown men doing the loading because they're faster, and you leave the boy to drive. And you hope he can manage it, but you do have to give him a driving lesson first. So that's families and households. Then we do houses and homes, because that's where these households live. So some of that's about construction, and you realise that timber-framed construction is actually quite difficult. And also, you don't want to waste timber, so as many accidents happen taking houses down, taking the timber frames of houses down, as putting them back up again. And interestingly, more people are killed in house collapses than house fires, because timber-framed houses will burn, but they burn quite slowly, like the Great Fire of London. Not many people killed despite the whole of the city of London burning down. But if a timber-framed house collapses on top of you, you can't get out. You're crushed under it. So lots of these kinds of building accidents, and also very large numbers of accidents with women fetching water. 1 in 8 accidental deaths for women and girls over the age of 5 is fetching water. Which is remarkable. It's horrible, but it's also remarkable, because if you read books on women's work in early modern England, they hardly ever say anything about fetching water, because I think it was so obvious to people at the time that maidservants just spent a lot of time going backwards and forwards to the well fetching water that nobody ever wrote it down. If it happens several times a day, you don't write in your diary, today my maidservant's got 3 buckets of water, because obviously that happens every day. You get lots and lots of these accidents, and the risk of death is actually higher the younger you are. So I think it's either 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 for girls between 5 and 14. It's about 1 in 6, 1 in 7 for spinsters, or unmarried women between about 14 and 21. Housewives is about 1 in 7. Partly just because housewives are doing more different risky things, but also because lots of these young girls just can't cope with the weight of the bucket of water, or they can't keep steady footing on slippery ponds and things like that. Townscapes. We look at towns. Classic town accidents, so marketplace accidents. Here's a shoemaker's stall in the Saturday market in Leicester. A great tempest, so as a storm comes down from the air, various timbers, part of the shop, fall on top of him. And there are some towns which don't send in their records, so we haven't got any accidents at all. There are some where we've actually got a lot. So a lot of Newcastle accidents, a lot of York accidents, a lot of Coventry accidents, and 15 for Leicester. And sometimes the ratio of accidents reported from a town and the size of the town looks about right. So there are a lot more accidents from York than there are from Wakefield, say, which is smaller than York, or Leeds, smaller than York at the time. On the other hand, there are very few from Shrewsbury, in fact the same number from Shrewsbury as there are from Church Stretton, which is a nice small village in the Stretton Hills outside. So the proportions don't always work, but where we have got lots from the town, we can think quite a lot about town life. And Southwark does come out with a bad reputation, it has to be said, with apologies to anyone resident in that fine borough. Londoners think of Southwark in the 16th century as the place you go for some quite dangerous entertainment, but you probably don't want to stay there. And so this accident would just fit everything they think about Southwark. You know, you go there because the plays are on in the playhouses, it's all a bit racy, but you want to get back safely to the City of London. So James Johnson, he's in an alley called Dead Man's Lane. You can see, you know, it's going downhill straight away, going from the borough of Southwark towards the Clink prison. So still, all the prisons are in, nearly all the prisons are in Southwark as well. He's drunk, lying on the ground asleep. He gets up, he's not properly sober. He goes along, decides he needs to relieve himself, let down his breeches. He's so lightheaded he falls headfirst into the ditch, and because the ditch is around his knees, he can't get up. The breeches around his knees, he can't get up again. So Londoners would say exactly that's just what you expect to happen in Southwark in the 16th century. Then we do landscapes, so we think, let's get out of the town to the countryside, and after all, about a quarter of people live in towns in the 16th century, about 3/4 in the countryside. So it's the opposite proportion from now. And here you can look at how the agricultural regimes are different in different parts, even of the same county, because of the landscape being different and the farming soil being different. So Wiltshire and Warwickshire are two big examples of this. Wiltshire, people talk about the chalk and the cheese. The chalk, which is the south eastern bit, rolling downs, valleys. You have sheep on the rolling downs. You farm for wheat and other high-value crops in the valleys. You bring the sheep down off the downs in the winter to manure the crops. You move them back again. You have this sheep and corn husbandry. The cheese, heavier soil, a lot more dairying, pasture farming, those sorts of activities, and also more wooded. And so you get classic chalk country accidents. You get accidents ploughing, rolling the fields, carts, and they're big fields. When a village calls a field the south field, it's just they haven't got very many fields, the east field, and so on. They're growing barley and wheat. Wheat is the hardest grain crop to grow in climatic terms in 16th century England, and barley is what you grow partly for bread, but more probably for malting for beer and ale. And they've got these huge stacks up to 18 feet high, and accidents carting it. There are sheep, washing sheep, ferrying them across the river, and you've got the downs, which are quite rough in bad weather. So you have this widow who sleeps the night in a hedge in heavy rain and cold weather on her way home from market in Evershot, where she'd had too much to drink. And we have numbers of people who don't quite make it home after drinking a bit too much and get exposure. Cheese country accidents. Enclosed roads, banks or stony hedges around the road, so we haven't got these big rolling open fields going between pasture lands and closes, enclosed fields. Clay soil, so they plough it with oxen rather than horses because the soil is so much heavier. Lots of hay being stored up for the cattle, so you get hay ricks rather than these big stacks of wheat and barley. Cattle-based industries, making cheese, tanning, leather, and cattle and pigs farmed together, and pigs turn out to be really dangerous for small children. And so you get numbers of really heart-rending accidents like this. Jane Fosbury and her one-year-old daughter living in a ruined building. She goes out to milk the cows, leaving the baby, and the pig comes in and attacks the baby. Pigs kill as many people as dogs in the 16th century, and more in sort of direct attacks. A lot of dog ones are indirect in various ways. So dog frightens horse and horse throws you off, whatever. Seed time and harvest is about the agricultural year. Scythes are lethally sharp. And this is one of the nice examples of 16th century people not being stupid, because they work out ways to do things safely. And so if you read some of these reports carefully, you realise what they do when they're scything is walk across the field in a staggered line, so that you can reap your swathe of the crops, and I can see what you've cut, and I'm sufficiently far behind you that you don't hit me, I don't hit you, and I can cut the next bit. And then the next person's just sufficiently far behind me that they can cut the bit that I haven't cut. And so you go backwards and forwards across the field. One of these cases, they go backwards and forwards for 4 hours, and eventually somebody makes a mistake, and somebody gets hit. And these injuries nearly all in the legs, but the sides are very sharp, and so people are getting cut quite deep. And lots of these people are dying a week later from infection rather than, some of them are from blood loss. And one of the other things we can do with this agricultural stuff is look at agricultural handbooks and see what do they tell you to do at different times of the year. So Thomas Tusser's 500 Points of Good Husbandry is our favourite one because it's in quite bad poetry. And he says things like, rake after scythe and pay thy tithe. And he tells you to do it in August, and here we are in August in Dorset with raking. That's the sort of high point of the agricultural, of the grain harvest. The high point of fruit is September. So September, he says, September blow soft till fruit be in loft. And here we are in Kent, lots of pear picking accidents, trees up to 40 feet high, lots of apple picking accidents. You get plum accidents as well. And the problem is the trees. People are either standing on boughs that aren't strong enough to hold them, or they think, well, I'm not standing on the bough of the tree, I'll go up a ladder, but then the ladder breaks. Fruit trees kill more people than guns in the 16th century. That's one of our interesting statistics. Then we have wild and tame, which is about animals. And here we can look at things like what kind of people are riding horses. There's an ambassador from Mantua to England in the 1550s who said, England's incredible, he said, even the peasants ride horses. And he clearly thinks it should be more like Mantua, where he rides a horse and the peasants just take their hats off and admire him as he goes past. But if you look at these people having accidents, yes, there are judges and esquires and gentlemen and clerics, people towards the top end of society, yeomen who are farming big farms producing a surplus for the market. But there are also husbandmen farming family farms. There are innkeepers, there are craftsmen, carpenters, people like that. There are also quite a lot of labourers, quite a lot of servants, quite a lot of boys and some girls. Spinsters, so young women, often young household servants, and lots of people who aren't identified, who will nearly all be labourers or servants, because if they were a cleric or a gentleman or something, then they're much more likely to be identified with their status. So all kinds of people are riding horses. The two reasons why that's easier than the Mantuan ambassador might imagine it to be is that rich people ride expensive horses and poor people ride cheap horses. We've got one horse described as an old debilitated white nag, which is worth 10p, whereas the judge is on a horse worth £4. So there is this big difference. And as I always say when lecturing on this, you can get run over by a Maserati, you can get run over by a Skoda, and I'm allowed to say that because I drive a Skoda. So that's one reason. The other reason, of course, is lots of the labourers in particular aren't riding their own horses. They're riding the plough horse back from the fields. Or their master says, quick, I need you to go into town and buy something, just take the horse because I need you to get back quickly. So that often people aren't riding their own horse. So you can work out, because things that are involved in the accident are forfeited to the king or queen, because they've caused the death of one of their subjects, then they get valued, so you can tell the valuation of the horses, and you can often tell who owned them. And we've also got hunting in here, so you learn about new things. Bat fowling. I didn't know what bat fowling was until I discovered Tudor accidents. Bat fowling is when you go round with a bat and catch fowl when they're not expecting it. So usually when they're roosting, and you might do it with a net, or you might do it with a bat, you might just hit them. There's one unfortunate man who, they've worked it out, he's standing on the other side of the hedge with the net, ready to catch the ducks. His friend is over the other side, whacking the hedge with the stick. What they don't realise is that the hedge is not quite as solid as they think, so the whacking comes right through the hedge and hits him on the head. We've got various sorts of hunting going on, and we discover the great dangers of sheep. Now, Thomas Tusser, who writes, no, it's not Thomas Tusser, it's the Leonard Maskell, who writes the book about how to look after livestock. He says sheep aren't dangerous, but he doesn't take into account the fact that sheep aren't dangerous, but taking sheep into rivers to wash them before you shear them is dangerous, because then you're in a river with a panicky sheep, and the panicky sheep might knock you over, or the panicky sheep might make its way off down the river and you try and follow it and get into deeper and deeper water and into more trouble. And often multiple people die, as with this accident at Sladburn up in the Pennines, because other people are working with you and they'll jump in to try and help. So we often get 2, 3, 4 people drowning in these sheep washing incidents. So that gets our animals chapter over. Then we do places of work. So this is other kind of jobs, some of which is very predictable. Where do you mine coal? Where the coal seams are, which is where the coal seams have been ever since. Where do you dig chalk, which the really hard sorts, like I think it's called clunch, which you get in maybe Bedfordshire, those can be used for building, but most of them, I think they are putting them into kilns to make lime, because you need lime plaster. And then tin mining in Devon and Cornwall. And as you can see, lots of coal mining accidents, but also lots of chalk mining accidents. And you get new technology. Now, this is a young man who doesn't understand a blast furnace. John William, the jurors' middle-aged prejudices start to come out. He was idle and moved by wantonness. And that's their explanation for why he climbed up to the top of the blast furnace and started kicking the charcoal around, not realising that somebody was lighting the fire at the bottom of the blast furnace, which would then produce a blast in which the smoke went shooting up through the blast furnace and he's suffocated by the blast of hot smoke coming up through the blast furnace. So you can see some kinds of industrial change going on in this way. Faith and festivity. Time for a bit of a break. Churches are nice, safe places in some respects, but not if your preacher is over-enthusiastic. Now, I think the man, William Reed, the vicar who's preaching here, he is a Cambridge graduate, and Cambridge in the 16th century does have a reputation for quite kind of fiery Protestant preaching, and I think he's just getting carried away because the works of Bullinger, now these works of Heinrich Bullinger, he's a Zurich theologian, his works are published in English translation, very popular amongst the sort of more advanced Elizabethan clergy, and as you can see from the book, they are quite hefty things. So it comes off the pulpit and hits the poor guy on the head, who is sitting very close. Maybe his hearing wasn't very good, or he's just really keen on the vicar's sermons and wanted to hear it. The really bad news is he went to doctors. He's a butcher, and butchers are reasonably prosperous businessmen often in the 16th century. Went to doctors and they said, "Don't worry, you'll be fine." And he wasn't. But then it took him 4 weeks to die. So maybe he died from something else, and this was the closest cause for it that anyone could find, was him being hit on the head by the falling book. So that's dangerous, and so is bell ringing. And 17th of November is the anniversary of Elizabeth I's accession, so in addition to the normal reasons for ringing bells, people start ringing bells in Elizabeth's reign on the 17th of November to celebrate her accession to the throne. Here they are at York Minster, ringing the first bell, so that may be the biggest bell at York Minster, and the bell rope catches him round the legs, lifts him off the ground, and he gets this head wound, and we have quite a lot of people killed bell ringing. Bell ringing does turn out to be quite a dangerous sport, but not as dangerous as some others like wrestling, because wrestling, like football, but it's most explicit with wrestling, is a test of manliness. I think because wrestling is one-on-one, so people just challenge each other to wrestling. There's one man who goes and finds his friend asleep in a field and just pokes him until he wakes up and starts wrestling. But this is the most explicit version of it, because it's the Four Yorkshiremen, which we all know from comedy enterprises of the distant past. The Three Yorkshiremen are wrestling quite happily in the churchyard, and then along comes Stephen Kingham, also from Skeckling, and he says that he is a manly man, and he could throw all three of them over the churchyard wall. And John Homler said he didn't think he could throw him over the churchyard wall. So Stephen Kingham, to show that he could throw him over the church wall, picked him up, and without malice or ill will, the jurors stress, picked him up and put him over the churchyard wall. And nobody playing football either, nobody takes their knife off before they start wrestling. So if you fall in the wrong way, your knife, which is at your belt, to cut up your food with, goes into your leg. If you're playing football, we have lots of people who die playing football, stabbing themselves in the leg. In this case, his knife goes into his elbow, cuts his blood vessels there. So that's faith and festivity. Then we have crime and control. Gun accidents are one of the big changes over the century. As you can see, no gun accidents at all, fatal gun accidents in the first decade of the century, then sort of up and down a bit, but fairly steady from the 1510s to the 1570s, and then 1580s, guns seem to spread quite widely through society to the point where one accidental death in 50 is an accidental death with a gun, and they're caused by all sorts of things. Much of it is a problem with the technology that early on they are matchlocks, so you have to have a burning string match to set off your gun, but the trouble with that is it can then also be set off by a spark from a candle or a fire or something like that. Then they think, well, that didn't work very well, let's try flintlocks, where you have a flint and a steel to set off a spark. But the trouble with those is that the springs are very sensitive. So the man who walks into a pub in Cirencester puts his gun down on the table and shoots himself in the bowels. So there are dangers with these things, but the most bizarre of these is trousers. I was tempted to headline this Guns and Hoses, but so John Young is shooting at a heron with a gun. The heron flew away. Robert forgot to put out the match that he's firing to shoot with. By reason of Robert's hose, they don't explain how this happened, but I suspect his trousers, because wide trousers are very fashionable in the 1560s, but London has legislation against wide trousers, and they actually have somebody on the city gates trying to stop people with excessively wide trousers coming into London. So I think probably he's just got very wide trousers. He catches the match, and off it goes. Then we get to trade and travel. You can use this to look at the contents of carts and boats, and there's this cart going into Canterbury, has all sorts of different stuff in it, hardware wire, upholsterers wear, mattresses, brass kettles, and so on. Then we have carts and wagons, problems with the technology. We've got books on how to drive your cart, and it says these are all the things to look out for. Keep an eye on the forehorse, the horse at the front of the team. Look out for children, look out for the body horse, the one in the middle of the team, especially in ruts and holes and dangerous ways. Then you've got to be near the thiller, that's the one between the shafts, because that's the closest you've got to a steering wheel. Because you haven't got any brakes, you haven't got a steering wheel, you have got a horse between the shafts, so that's what you use to kind of control things. Be very careful overthrowing, you don't want the whole cart to turn over. Going down a hill, hold on to it from behind, going up a hill, weigh it before, and be careful with posts and gates. So we've got 1,492 cart accidents. This is just the 1550s ones. Thill horse, the one between the shafts, is involved in lots and lots of the accidents. So that is the key one to try and keep control of. He doesn't say, because he maybe thought it was obvious, don't fall asleep when you're driving. So there are significant numbers of people who fall asleep driving and then fall off. And in terms of situations and locations, overturning is really bad, so he's right to warn you about overturning. Children are a problem, posts, gates, ruts, obstacles. Going downhill is really bad with no brakes. Maybe we could have guessed that. But also he doesn't say be careful when you're loading. And lots and lots of people have accidents loading, partly because, particularly in harvest, they're jumping on and off the carts to try and load them fast, and the ropes snap. And of course, if you're standing 4, 5, 6 feet up on a cart, pulling very hard on a rope, and then the rope snaps, you go off backwards. So people are cracking their heads, breaking their necks, and so on. Boats and ships also have problems. Here's a barge problem. Again, one of these, there are not many of these, but it shows you how locks work. It's a western barge, one of the barges that goes up and down the Thames, taking grain from places like Oxfordshire into London, going through Cotterell's Lock, which is now Shiplake Lock, on the Thames. They're pulling it through with a rope, his feet slip, and he falls in. Because if you've got a lock going down the river, you fill up the lock with water, then you open the gates and let the thing through. But going up the river, you've got to pull the boat through. So that's what they're doing. And lastly, we have ways of dying, where we tried to do a bit of comparison with modern injury statistics. It rapidly gets quite difficult because, for example, lots of us die in falls. But we're dying in falls when we're elderly and we're tripping on carpets or falling down the stairs or things like that. Not as many of them were elderly, not as many of them had multi-storey houses. They're dying in falls, but they're falling out of fruit trees, they're falling off carts, and so on. But to some extent you can make comparisons. You can certainly make comparisons with things like how long does it take you to die. Head injuries will kill you often quite quickly now, and they kill you quite quickly in the 16th century. Things like scalding, horribly, will kill you slowly but inevitably now, if it's bad enough, as they did in the 16th century. The last thing we try and do is think, who do we think we are in this circumstance? And actually, in some ways, you can sympathise with the jurors, I found, possibly just because I'm a middle-aged man. So you get jurors who say things like this. Here's John Cheeseman of Leeds. He's a young man. He's long had a hernia in his stomach. He was in a chamber in the house of Anthony Davy of Leeds, it's Leeds in Kent, with divers adolescents and young men. It's an inn. They're playing wantonly together and jumping or dancing. John was drunk, caring little for his hernia. He conducted himself wantonly in a disorderly manner. You tell the jurors are just getting more and more annoyed, shaking and crushing his body with running and falling many times. He broke more greatly what had been broken before, so that a great part of his entrails, by misfortune, was thrust up out of his stomach to his outer skin. Couldn't be put back into his stomach again. He greatly laboured with adverse health and then died. And then the jurors just think they've got to bang the final nail in. They say, so he died by misfortune and from his own bad conduct. And you think, well, you know, once you reach middle age, you do sometimes think, what do they think they're doing? But equally, there are times when you think, what did these people think they're doing? And then you think, oh, hang on, I think I know. So lots of particularly young people, young household servants, do this. They're leading an animal, a horse or a cow, or usually a horse or a cow. He's leading the mare with a halter. He's got one end tied around his right hand, and they will tie halters round their arm, round their hand, round their chest. One, the jurors even say he tied it round his neck, and that really wasn't a good idea. And if you talk to anybody who works with horses or cattle now, they say, no, you hold it so that you're holding it firmly, but it can run through your hands or you can drop it. But I suspect if you're a young household servant and your master or mistress says to you, take the mare to the river for a drink, you just calculate, I cannot lose that horse. I can't go home and say, sorry, the horse ran away, because they throw me out. So you think, all right, I'll tie it onto me and hope for the best. And presumably lots of times it works and sometimes it doesn't, and people get dragged off as he did and get these terrible injuries, the head wounds 6 inches long, 6 inches wide, so he's injured like that. Now, we always think with these talks we should finish by giving some health and safety advice, because as UK taxpayers, you have paid for this. So, I mean, and don't go to Rutland. You know, I'll be in terrible trouble with the Rutland Tourist Authority if I actually gave that as advice. So do go to Rutland. It's very nice. And the holiday cottages are, you know, reasonably priced. Well, I know because I've got daughters in Cambridge and Derbyshire, so Rutland's quite a good place to meet in between. 2 pieces of advice. Don't dance in the kitchen. Now, this man is dancing in the kitchen. He is drunk, so if you're drunk, don't dance in the kitchen. And he is trying to dance on one leg. So if you are dancing in the kitchen while drunk, try and keep both legs on the ground. And also don't do it with an open fire. And you might think, well, how could anybody be foolish enough to dance on one leg while drunk in a kitchen with an open fire with boiling water on it? But in fact, whatever Sophie Ellis-Bextor may say, just don't dance in the kitchen, because this is our other dancing in the kitchen incident. He isn't in trouble. He's not drunk. He isn't in trouble with the fire at all. He just spins round once too often and impales himself on the roasting spit. So mind how you go, as people always say in these circumstances. And I think we're now going to stop and have some questions.
Steve, thank you. Now is the time for questions. If you're in the room and you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand. There are a couple of roving mics. Anybody who is on screen, it's lovely to have you on screen. I think you have a chat bar, so just type something in and I'll try and keep an eye on what's coming in on screen. But have we got anybody in the room to start with? Yes, gentleman at the back there.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant, Steve. Thank you. Which death made you laugh the most?
Makes me laugh the most.
Yeah.
Different ones on different days. I think it's the bizarre ones, obviously, that make me laugh most. And the one where I thought, how on earth did that happen? There's a man who's asleep on a cart. he rolls off the cart and a large fish rolls off the cart and lands on top of him and suffocates him. And I was describing that to some students who I'm afraid said, well, he must have been very, very drunk, which is possible. But I think it's also possible that the fish was quite large. If you imagine a big pike or something, or they would count a porpoise as a fish. If it's wrapped in a wet cloth to try and keep it fresher, then maybe that could suffocate you. But that one is quite weird.
Howard, up in the front, please. There's somebody up here.
You mentioned a number of people who drowned. Was it unusual to know how to swim in those days?
It's more unusual then than it is now, because it's quite hard to learn to swim if there aren't safe places to learn, and it's also quite hard to learn if you don't know other people who can swim, who can teach you. Yeah, on the other hand, lots of people clearly can swim, because they talk about men, so about 40% of our deaths are drownings. The women are mostly fetching water. A lot of the men are working men in June and July when it's very hot. They've been working, and at the end of the day's work, because lots of these things happen at 6, 7, 8 in the evening, they're stripping off and just jumping in the nearest pond or river. And lots of them clearly can't swim because it says they're standing washing themselves and then they lose their footing and then they can't get out. Some of them clearly can, because it talks about them swimming and getting cramp. Some of them they tie bladders on, like water wings, to help themselves swim, and then sometimes the buckle breaks and the bladders get washed away. We have somebody who says he went to a pond to try to teach himself to swim, but of course there wasn't anybody else there and he got into trouble, so there was nobody to rescue him. So certainly people are learning to swim. Students try to learn to swim. But there's a sort of intellectual history argument for this, that actually the Romans and the Greeks swam, so Odysseus swims and Julius Caesar and people swim. So suddenly with the Renaissance, people think, oh, that's fashionable, I better try and learn to swim, like all those Greek and Roman heroes. And lots and lots of Cambridge University students drown at Grantchester trying to learn to swim, such that the university actually has to ban trying to learn to swim. First offence, public beating in the hall of your college. Second offence, expulsion from the university. And there's a fellow of St John's who writes a Latin book about how to learn to swim. So there you go. So he was clearly, the others, it was a trahison de clerc or something. He was somebody who wasn't doing his bit for the team when they were trying to stop students learning to swim.
I'm going to just ask one from John Saunders online about you. What first sparked your interest in accidental deaths? Was it because it's a seemingly neglected topic?
I think it's because it's a way into what people are doing all day. Because, as with the fetching water, but as with so many other things, this is things that people just don't write down. Nobody says, obviously, I think I better wash my sheep before I shear it, but it might be really dangerous if the sheep panics in the river. And yet that's clearly something that you just have to take into account. And most of the time, we can only write history books about things that are so momentous at the time that people write about them, or so controversial at the time that people write about them. So the enormous quantities of legal records from 16th century England, but they're all about people arguing about who owns which piece of land or who's allowed to put their cow on this field or not. And presumably most people aren't having an argument about that stuff most days. Most days they're just getting on with milking the cow. Getting on with ploughing the field, and so it's a way to access those areas of life that you can't otherwise get at.
And then there's a follow-up that is interesting, in fact, from the same person. Is it just coroner's reports that you looked at, or is there a broader base of evidence available about accidents?
The broader base is thin, but it does confirm what you're finding in the coroner's reports. So, for example, the mirror image of it is the health and safety advice. So things like what to watch out for when you're driving your cart, or what to watch out for when you're looking after your cow, or things like that, or what time do you pick fruit. So that's the sort of mirror image. The important, not important, but the sort of spectacular accidents are sometimes reported in chronicles. So like the London Chronicler that talks about the ship sinking, the boat sinking on the Thames while Elizabeth's having the firework display. Some of those, if you like, celebrity accidents happen so close to the court that they're investigated by the court's own household coroner, most of which records don't come through into this. So there's there's a courtier, I think originally Spanish, called Sir Jakes Granado, who is giving a sort of riding display in front of King Philip and Queen Mary, and slips off his horse and bangs his head on the wall of the garden at Whitehall Palace, and is killed. And so that comes up in Chronicles, but not in the inquest. But the one which is sensationally discussed at the time and does come up in the inquest is when Amy Robsart, who is the wife of Lord Robert Dudley, who is about to become the Earl of Leicester, who is spending more time with Queen Elizabeth than many people think appropriate, possibly including his wife Amy Robsart. She falls down the stairs in a house in Cumnor in Oxford, and people at the time say, did Leicester have her killed so that he could marry the Queen? Did Leicester's enemies have her killed in order to make it impossible for him to marry the Queen, even if anything happened to her? Was she in despair at what her husband was doing, so she threw herself down the stairs? Well, the coroner's inquest doesn't answer those questions, but it does say she was found at the bottom of the stairs with a broken neck and 2 dents in her head. But of course you can't tell whether she got the 2 dents in her head falling down the stairs, or whether somebody gave her the 2 dents in her head and she then fell down the stairs. What we can do, again, because we've got so many of these things, is set it in context, because some people commenting on that death say, oh well, it's highly suspicious because nobody died falling downstairs in the 16th century. Actually, we have got significant numbers of people who fall downstairs and hit their heads or break their necks, or in some cases they're carrying something sharp like a candlestick and they fall onto that. So you certainly can get killed falling downstairs. It's just that fewer buildings are multi-storey in the 16th century, and there are more other ways to get killed.
Yeah, that's so interesting. We're still now having debates about what questions coroners should ask and whether you ask, were you pushed down the stairs or did you fall? And all that scope of inquest stuff is still something we're debating even now. In the room, who have we got? Lots of people. I'm going to go to you, sir, please, next, and then I'll come to you at the back afterwards.
You've focused your research around accidents. Is there any evidence of there being a culture of friends or family like seeking retribution or legal recourse as a result of someone hitting their head on someone else's horse, or hitting someone else's mill, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
The compensation culture, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes.
For
Well,
American friends.
There's the compensation culture in the sense that there's a penalty for running somebody over with your cart because you forfeit your cart. So from that point of view, the state, if you like, is punishing people for dangerous negligence, but that doesn't compensate the family. I think there's not much sign that there is really compensation for the family, and there are very occasionally. So, for example, there's an interesting witchcraft case in the early 17th century in Berkshire, which is clearly related to feuds between families in a village. And part of the feud is when one of the sons of one of the families gets killed in a football match, and they blame the son of one of the other families, and I think that's found to be an accident, but there may still be bad blood over it because of that. So, but lots of these things, I think we just can't. We haven't got the other records that would tell us, sadly.
There was a question at the back, and then I'll come up to Sam in the front. So, you, sir.
Hi, Professor Gunn. It's a similar question to that last one. Was there any concept of a 16th century life insurance policy?
No, not really. So insurance, it's just developing at the time, but it's for long distance ship voyages and things like that. There's no fire insurance for houses or anything like that in the 16th century. It only develops, I think, late 17th, early 18th century. So they don't really think in those terms. They clearly do think in terms of how can we do things safely. So there's one thing which comes close to these sort of negligence issues where the coroners actually say, the person who got this person to go down the well and dig out the well should have given them some kind of protective headgear. And certainly you get things where, for example, the coroners will instruct people who have a mill with an open mill stream to put a fence around the mill stream because people keep falling in the mill stream. So it's not, because sometimes people say, oh, well, everybody in the 16th century just believed in providence and thought, well, if that happens to you, obviously that's your numbers up, and it's only really in the 18th century that people start to take practical measures. I don't think that's true at all. You can see them taking practical measures in the 16th century, and you can also see these things like mowing in a staggered line or wells. They clearly realise lots and lots of people drown fetching water because rich towns will put in pumps. And then because we've got somebody in Coventry who dies trying to mend the pump, presumably because he's in a pit underground soldering something. So he just gets surrounded by solder fumes, soldering these lead pipes for the pump. So they try to put in pumps. They obviously safer than just having a pond with a bucket. You have a well of the sort we imagine as a wishing well with a bucket that goes up and down on a rope, and you have a handle that you turn and a barrel. And we've got those coming up in the accidents, but it's because people can have accidents with those. So sometimes the thing's spinning too fast and the wooden post breaks and a bit of the wood comes off and hits people. Or we've got a few unfortunate people who they want to see how the bucket's doing, so they put their hand on the barrel, look down the well, and of course the barrel spins round and they lose their balance and fall headfirst down the well. So you can try and make things safer, but sooner or later something will go wrong. Seems to be the lesson of that, which seems to be true with anything, doesn't it?
Thank you.
Sam.
And with that dramatic increase in gun deaths, what evidence can you see of gun control, another thing we seem to be debating currently?
Yes, well, there's meant to be gun control by social standing. So poor people aren't supposed to have guns. Rich people complained from the mid-16th century that there are all these people who surely aren't rich enough to have a gun license who are just going around blasting away at the wild fowl. You can't have a proper afternoon's hawking anymore because all the ducks are just being shot out of the sky as soon as they take off. I suspect this is slightly, high blood pressure country gentlemen reacting to it. But they do seem to be spreading quite widely. Again, I suppose part of the issue is whose gun is it? So if you have a household servant shooting a gun, I think most likely they don't own that gun. Their master has said, quick, see if you can shoot a couple of duck for dinner, and sent them out with a gun. So there are attempts at regulation in that sense, and there's also early on the attempts at regulation are because the government at the centre, but also local governments acting on it, are quite obsessed with making men do archery practice, and they think the spread of guns is not good for people doing archery practice, so they should be discouraged so that there's more archery. Then by the mid-16th century you get completely mixed messages because the government's writing to towns saying, can you send us 100 people happy to come and learn to shoot guns because we actually need them for the war in Scotland, while simultaneously saying everybody should be doing archery practice and guns are bad for you. So there's very mixed messages then, and by the late 16th century, though some people are still turning up for musters with longbows, it's becoming pretty accepted that modern warfare in the later 16th century demands pikes and by that stage muskets, which are heavy guns, or arquebuses, calibers, which are lighter guns. So there's a bit of schizophrenia really over how far you're trying to control it and how far you're trying to encourage it.
We have lots of questions. Should we just take one more, and then we'll go on to the next phase of this evening. So there was somebody over there. Yes. I don't know what to do now. You, sir, caught my eye first of all. So should we come to you? There's a mic coming to you. Do you want to just hold on a minute and let's get a mic to you? Thank you. Wait a minute. We've got one here, and then I'll come to you, sir.
Sorry. Do coroners investigate deaths due to medical practice in this state? Or?
Yes. So you do get particularly things where two surgeons have disagreed. So you'll have accounts where they say, well, they were being treated by this surgeon, but then it didn't seem to be working very well, so they went to this other surgeon who said, that's okay, I'll amputate, and then they amputated and the person died. So they just want to go over that to make sure that they're sure it was an accident rather than murder by the surgeon. But obviously you have to find quite extreme evidence to suggest that the surgeon actually took their money and then murdered them rather than attempting to treat them but it failing. And you also get people who are treated and then they pull their plaster off and then they bleed and that sort of thing. And you also get sort of home surgery. So like the lady with the young woman with the arsenic worm medicine, you've got somebody who's got a friend who's a butcher who says, well, it's okay, I'll draw some blood from you because that will even up the humours in your body a bit. And he does it with a little hazel stick and presumably just sticks it into a vein and tries to take some blood out, and then presumably there's infection or something and he then dies. So yes, so there is some evidence of failed medical treatment.
Should we have one? There's one out from you, sir. I
yeah.
rather rudely cut across you, so let's get you the microphone.
Oh, a very quick question. What's the situation now in Port Meadow, which has had ups and downs of gunfire and amateur rifle practice, all sorts of other things. The CCF, I think, sometimes make people march around parts of it. And it's something of a hazard for many of the wild bird species in particular.
Yes, I think there's probably not much shooting there now, but the things that people get worried about are things like discarded plastic rubbish, because there are still horses on there, and so there's worry that the horses are too closely in contact with urban populations who are distributing stuff around. The Port Meadow and Wolvercote is also interesting because it's a nice example in the 16th century of somewhere which is disputed between the owners of Wolvercote Manor and the town authorities, and you have a riot at a coroner's inquest in Wolvercote, where the people of where the mayor turns. They've got the mayor's mace. They've got the sort of green baize cloth on the table. They're all sitting down to have the Oxford coroner's inquest, and then the locals turn up and say, "But this isn't in Oxford," and they overthrow the table, and there's claim people are throwing shoes at the mayor and all sorts of things. So Wolvercote and Port Meadow are quite exciting. I'm sure they're exciting places now, but they're quite exciting places in the 16th century.
Good. I think we should. Thank you, Steve. It really has been, it's been captivating, hasn't it? It's just been like a window on a 16th century world, and you've transported us all back there. Thank you so much for your time and coming to talk to us. Thank you also to Patrick Long from Lazard, who sponsors us coming here for the last few years in the annual lecture that we have, but we're beautifully accommodated, and it's just a great pleasure to come here, and thank you for that. Thank you as ever to the team from Merton for getting us organised and getting us here and making it all work so seamlessly. Thank you.